The rope was coarse, its shadow a long dark finger pointing across the mud-rutted street. It lay coiled in Jedediah Thorne's hand, a promise of swift and brutal judgment. The crowd was a tense, breathing thing, their faces pinched by the wind and a thirst for righteousness. At the center of it all stood Silas, his hands bound, his head bowed. He wore the stillness of a man who had made peace with endings. Rainwater dripped from his hair, tracing a line down a cheekbone already bruised and swollen. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. His silence was an accusation the townsfolk couldn't quite decipher, and it unsettled them more than any plea for mercy ever could. Thorne, a man whose wealth was built on the fear of others, raised his voice to fill that silence. This is what we do with outlaws. This is how we protect our homes, our families. He brought violence to our doorstep, and he will answer for it. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. They were good people, mostly, but fear was a sickness that could make a monster of any man. They saw the blood on Silas's coat, the haunted look in his eyes, and they saw the guilt Thorne insisted was there. From the edge of the crowd, a woman watched. Elara had been an outcast for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. They called her the widow of a coward, a woman tainted by a tragedy she had survived, but her husband had not. She lived on the forgotten edge of town. Her land as barren as the whispers that followed her. Beside her, a small boy named Finn held her hand, his knuckles white. He was a child who had seen too much and spoken nothing since the day Silas had carried him out of the wilderness, half-frozen and orphaned. The boy's eyes were fixed on Silas, not with fear, but with a desperate, clinging hope. Elara felt that same hope, a fragile, impossible thing, rise in her own chest. She had seen the gentleness in the stranger's hands when he tended to the boy. She had seen the sorrow in his eyes, a sorrow she recognized as her own. She could not let this happen. Taking a deep breath that tasted of rain and injustice, she let go of Finn's hand and took a step forward. And then another. The crowd parted for her, their expressions shifting from righteous anger to surprise and disdain. She ignored them, her gaze locked on the coiled rope. She stopped before Thorne, her small frame a stark contrast to his blustering presence. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a striking bell. Put down the rope. Thorne laughed, a cruel, barking sound. Get back to your weeds, Elara. This is men's business. He made to push past her, but she stood her ground. You call him an outlaw. You shout about justice, but I don't see a trial. I see a mob. She looked from Thorne to the faces in the crowd, her eyes meeting one after another. You know me. You've judged me for years. But I am still one of you, and I am telling you, you are about to kill an innocent man. Her gaze finally settled on Silas. His head had lifted, his eyes, gray as a stormy sea, meeting hers for the first time. In them, she saw a flicker of something that was not surrender. It was astonishment. Thorne's face purpled with rage. He's a killer. He's a menace. Elara's voice grew stronger, imbued with the conviction that came from a deep, unshakable core of her being. No, I see a soul worth redeeming. Give him to me. The proposal was so outlandish, so utterly unexpected, that a stunned silence fell over the street. Thorne stared at her, speechless. What did you say? She met his glare without flinching. Give him into my custody. Let him work off his debt on my land. If he is the monster you claim, then let him be my problem. If he is not, then let the shame be yours. It was a desperate gamble, a fool's bargain, and she knew it. But as she looked at the silent man with the bruised face and the lost boy who clung to her side, she knew it was the only move she had left to make. The walk to her farm was a long one, made in a silence as thick and heavy as the gray clouds overhead. Silas followed a few paces behind her, his hands now unbound, but his posture still coiled, with a tension that spoke of years spent on the edge. He moved with a quiet economy, his footsteps barely disturbing the wet earth. Finn walked between them, a small, silent bridge over a chasm of unspoken history. He would occasionally reach back, his small fingers brushing against Elara's skirt, a silent check to make sure she was still there. Elara's farmhouse was little more than a cabin, hunkered down against the vast, unforgiving plains. Its wood was weathered to the color of bone, and the fence that marked its boundary was a line of broken teeth. It was a place of solitude, a place to be forgotten. As they approached, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls, a lonely, mournful sound. Inside, the air was cold. The fire in the hearth was long dead, its ashes a pale gray ghost. There was one main room, a small sleeping loft, and a table with 2 chairs. It was the architecture of a life pared down to its essentials. Silas stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the entire frame. He looked at the meager room, his eyes taking in the war room, the neatly patched quilt on the single cot, the sparse pantry. He was a man accustomed to hardship, but there was a deep-seated poverty here that went beyond a lack of coin. It was a poverty of hope. Elara felt a flush of shame, her home laid bare to the judgment of this stranger. "It's not much," she said, her voice small. He finally moved, stepping inside and closing the door, shutting out the wind. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt unervingly final. He didn't reply to her statement. Instead, his gaze fell on the empty hearth. Without a word, he walked to the woodpile beside it, his movements stiff from his injuries. He knelt, his large hands surprisingly deft as he arranged the kindling. Elara watched, a knot of uncertainty in her stomach. She had stood for him, had offered him sanctuary, but she did not know him. She had invited a storm into her house, and she had no idea if it would tear her down or wash her clean. Later, as twilight bled across the sky, they sat at the small table. A fire now crackled in the hearth, casting long dancing shadows on the walls and filling the small cabin with a fragile warmth. The space felt different now, less a tomb and more a shelter. Elara had made a thin stew from the last of her vegetables and a bit of salted meat. It wasn't much, but it was hot. She placed a bowl in front of Silas, another in front of Finn, and took the last for herself. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls and the whisper of the fire. Finn, who usually picked at his food, ate with a quiet focus, his eyes darting between Silas and Elara. Silas ate slowly, methodically, as if every bite was a conscious decision. When he finished, he didn't push his bowl away. He simply placed his spoon beside it and folded his hands on the table. His eyes met Elara's across the flickering candlelight. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, rough from disuse, but they carried a weight that filled the entire room. It was more than thanks for the meal. It was thanks for the fire. It was thanks for standing in the mud and speaking when no one else would. Elara simply nodded, her throat too tight to form a reply. In the quiet intimacy of the firelight, surrounded by the vast, dark plains, a silent understanding began to form. They were 2 outcasts, 2 lonely souls, sharing a meal in a broken house, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt entirely alone. The storm broke just after midnight. It came not with a gentle warning of distant thunder, but with a sudden, violent roar of wind that rattled the cabin to its foundations. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, hammering against the roof and walls. Finn, asleep in the loft, cried out. Elara was there in an instant, her hand on his back, murmuring soft reassurances. Down below, Silas was already on his feet, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. He was looking at the ceiling, where a dark, wet spot was rapidly spreading. A steady drip began to fall, landing with a grim rhythm on the floorboards. Elara came down from the loft, her heart sinking. "The barn," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "The hay. It's all we have for the winter." Without a word, Silas pulled on his coat, grabbed the rusted bucket from beside the door, and met her eyes. It was not a question, but a statement. "We go," she nodded, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and they plunged into the maelstrom. The wind tore at them, a physical force that sought to push them back. The rain was blinding, instantly soaking them to the bone. The short distance to the barn felt like miles. Inside, the situation was worse than she'd feared. The wind had ripped several boards from the roof, and rain was pouring in, soaking the small stack of hay that was meant to see her lone milked cow through the winter. The smell of wet earth and decay was already thick in the air. Despair washed over Elara, cold and sharp as the rain. It was too much. The farm was failing, the town hated her, and now nature itself seemed intent on stripping away the little she had left. She stood frozen, the roar of the storm filling her ears, feeling the last of her resolve crumble. Then a hand touched her arm. It was Silas. He had to shout to be heard over the wind. "The wagon canvas. Is it still here?" She nodded numbly, pointing toward a dark corner. What followed was a desperate, chaotic ballet conducted in the dark. With only the intermittent flashes of lightning to see by, they worked. Silas, with a strength that belied his injuries, climbed the slick support beams into the rafters. He shouted instructions, his voice a low rumble against the storm's high shriek. Elara, her hands numb with cold, scrambled to find rope and tools, handing them up to him. She fought to drag the heavy, waterlogged canvas across the barn floor. He was a man of few words, but up there, in the heart of the storm, he was decisive, focused. He moved with a purpose that seemed to push back against the chaos. There was no time for thought, only action. They were a team bound by a shared, urgent need to simply survive the night. At one point, her foot slipped on the wet hay, and she started to fall. In an instant, he was down from the rafters, his arm shooting out to steady her. His grip was firm, his hand warm against her cold, wet sleeve. They stood there for a heartbeat, the storm raging around them, close enough to feel the heat from each other's bodies. In the brief, stark glare of a lightning flash, their eyes met. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, holding each other up against the fury of the night. It was a moment of profound, unspoken connection, a spark of warmth in the freezing rain. Then it was gone. He released her, and without a word, turned back to his work. But something had shifted. The space between them was no longer filled with the cautious distance of strangers, but with the silent, resonant hum of a shared struggle. The dawn broke pale and bruised, the storm having exhausted itself into a weeping gray sky. The world was washed clean, but the cold had settled deep into the bones of the land. Elara walked into town with her basket, the few coins she possessed tied in a knot in her handkerchief. The canvas patch on the barn roof had held, but they had lost nearly a third of the hay. She needed supplies, and she needed credit, a commodity she knew was in shorter supply than her cash. The town regarded her with a new kind of hostility. Before, it was pity and disdain. Now, it was suspicion. By taking in Silas, she had not only defied Jedediah Thorne, she had aligned herself with the very thing they feared, the unknown, the outlaw. Mrs. Gable at the mercantile counted her coins with deliberate, insulting slowness. "Not much here, Elara." Her voice was as sour as the pickles in the barrel beside her. "Times are hard." Elara kept her gaze steady. "I need flour and salt. I can pay the rest next month," Mrs. Gable sniffed. "Thorne's buying up debts. Says it's for the town's security. I can't be extending credit that might put me on his bad side." It was the same everywhere she went. Doors that were once grudgingly open were now firmly shut. Whispers followed her down the boardwalk, sharp and stinging as hornets. Harboring a killer. No respect for the law. She's as wild as he is. She saw Thorne standing outside the saloon, watching her, a smug smile on his face. He had orchestrated this. He was turning her own town into a cage, isolating her, trying to starve her out. Her shoulders sagged with the weight of it all. The basket felt heavy and empty in her hands. Defeated, she turned for home with nothing but a small bag of oats she'd managed to trade for some mending work. As her farm came into view, she saw a figure by the fence line. It was Silas. He was working. He had found a small pile of discarded lumber behind the barn and was methodically replacing the rotted posts of her fence. He wasn't just patching it. He was rebuilding it, making it strong. He worked with a quiet, relentless rhythm. He would dig the post hole, set the new wood, and pack the earth around it until it stood firm and straight. He stopped when he saw her approaching, his eyes immediately going to her empty basket. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could read the story in the tired set of her shoulders. She stopped a few feet from him, the newly mended section of fence between them. "They wouldn't sell to me," she said, the words tasting like ash. He looked at the fence post in his hand, then back at her. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a shared understanding of what it meant to be on the outside. He then turned his attention back to his work, lifting a heavy mallet. The thud of the wood striking the post was a solid, grounding sound. Thud. A new post, driven deep into the earth. Thud. A line being drawn against the world. Thud. He was not just mending a fence. He was building a wall. He was protecting this small, broken patch of land. He was protecting her. She stood there for a long time, watching him, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of his labor. And for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of something that was not despair. It was the quiet, stubborn resilience of a fence post driven deep into hostile ground. The nights grew colder. The thin walls of the cabin offered little defense against a wind that carried the first hint of snow. The fire in the hearth was their anchor, a small circle of light and warmth against the encroaching dark. It was in these quiet hours that the ghosts of the past seemed to draw closest. Some nights, Elara would be awakened by a sound from below, a muffled cry strangled in Silas's throat. She would lie still in her loft, listening to the tense silence that followed, knowing he was down there, awake and staring into the shadows, wrestling with demons she could not see. She never spoke of it. She knew some wounds were too deep to bear the weight of words. Her own scars were quieter. A sudden loud noise, a log shifting in the fire, a board creaking in the wind, would make her flinch, her body instantly rigid, her breath catching in her throat. In those moments, she would feel Silas's eyes on her, his gaze steady and questioning, but he never pressed. He simply offered a silence that was not empty, but patient. It was a silence that allowed her to find her own way back from the edge. Finn remained the quiet center of their small world. The boy still did not speak, but he was slowly, cautiously unfurling. He followed Silas around the farm like a shadow, watching him work with wide, serious eyes. He would hand him tools, his small hands reaching up with a touching solemnity. One afternoon, while Silas was sharpening an axe, his movements precise and practiced, Finn sat nearby, whittling a small piece of softwood. For hours he worked with a fierce concentration, his tongue poking out from the corner of his mouth. When he was finished, he walked over to Silas and held out his hand. In his palm lay a small, crudely carved bird. Its wings were uneven, its shape barely recognizable, but it had been made with a child's earnest devotion. Silas stopped his work. He carefully wiped his hands on his trousers before reaching out and taking the small object. He held it in his large, calloused palm, his thumb gently stroking the rough wood. He looked at the bird, then he looked at Finn. A change came over his face, a subtle softening of the hard lines around his eyes and mouth. It was as if a tightly locked door within him had creaked open, just a crack. He knelt down, so he was eye level with the boy. "This is a fine thing," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "A very fine thing." Finn didn't smile, but a light came into his eyes. He had given a gift, and it had been received. It was a transaction of trust, a bond forged without a single spoken word. Later that evening, Elara saw Silas sitting by the fire, long after she and Finn had gone to bed. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft hiss of the flames. In his hands, he held the small wooden bird. He wasn't looking at it. He was just holding it, his fingers wrapped around it as if it were a precious, fragile thing. She watched him from the shadows of the loft, a strange ache in her chest. She was beginning to see the man behind the outlaw, the gentle heart hidden beneath the stoic exterior. He was a man haunted by his past, scarred by loss, yet capable of profound tenderness. She saw the way he held the child's small gift, and she understood. He wasn't just holding a piece of carved wood. He was holding on to a sliver of hope, a reason to keep fighting against the ghosts that haunted his nights. And in that quiet, firelit moment, her heart ached for him and with him. The first snow fell not as a gentle blanket, but as a fine, biting sleet that promised a bitter winter. With it came a new crisis. Finn woke with a fever, his small body trembling beneath the patched quilts. His breathing was shallow and ragged, a dry, rasping cough shaking his frame. By midday, he was burning up, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Elara. She bundled up and ran the entire way to town, her pleas for the doctor echoing in the empty, windswept street. Dr. Miller met her at his door, his face a mask of regretful refusal. "I'm sorry, Elara," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Thorne. He came by this morning. He made it clear that any assistance given to your household would be seen as a defiance of the town council." He wrung his hands, a man trapped between his oath and his fear. "My hands are tied." Elara stared at him, disbelief turning to a cold, hard fury. "He's a child. This isn't about Silas. This is about a sick little boy." But her words were lost to the wind. The doctor had already retreated back into the warmth of his house, the click of the lock a final, damning verdict. She returned to the cabin, defeated and terrified, the sleet stinging her face like frozen tears. Silas was waiting. He took one look at her face and knew. While she had been gone, he had not been idle. He had stripped Finn of his sweaty clothes and was bathing him with cool water. His large, rough hands were surprisingly gentle as he wiped the boy's forehead, murmuring low, soothing sounds that weren't quite words. "There's a feverfew patch that grows by the creek," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her sea of panic. "And willow bark. I saw some on the way in. It'll help with the fever." He was no longer just a silent worker. He had taken charge, his knowledge of the frontier, of survival, coming to the forefront. While Elara watched over Finn, Silas ventured back out into the worsening weather. He returned an hour later, covered in a dusting of snow, his hands full of roots and bark. He set a pot to boil over the fire, the bitter, medicinal scent of his remedies soon filling the small cabin. For 2 days and nights, they fought the fever together. They took turns sitting with Finn, forcing sips of the willow bark tea between his lips, changing the cool compresses on his head. The world shrank to the confines of that small, firelit room. The town Thorne, the future none of it mattered. All that existed was the child's labored breathing and their shared, desperate effort to keep it from stopping. In the darkest hours of the second night, Finn's breathing grew alarmingly shallow. Elara, exhausted and frail, began to lose hope. her tears falling silently onto the quilt. Silas came and stood behind her, his hand resting for a moment on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with a profound, grounding strength. "He's a fighter," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "He won't give up. So we don't either." He gently took the cloth from her hand and continued bathing the boy's face. She watched him, his profile stark and determined in the firelight. He was more than a protector. He was a healer. He had been cast out, called a monster, but here in the crucible of a child's fever, his true nature was revealed. He was a man of quiet, unyielding gentleness, a man who would walk into a storm to find a cure, a man who would stand against the world for a life he barely knew. And as she watched him care for the boy, a new warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a feeling she had long forgotten, a dangerous, fragile, and undeniable stirring of the heart. The fever broke with the dawn of the third day. Finn woke, weak but lucid, the fire in his eyes replaced by a calm clarity. He looked at Elara, then at Silas, and a small, weak smile touched his lips. The relief in the cabin was a palpable thing, as real as the morning light streaming through the window. The shared crisis had forged a new intimacy between them, a bond tempered in fear and sleepless nights. But their small pocket of peace was short-lived. A week later, as Silas was chopping wood, 3 men rode up to the farm. They were Thorne's men, their faces set in smug, belligerent lines. Thorne himself was not with them. He was a man who preferred to let others do his dirty work. The leader, a burly man named Cole, dismounted. "Thorne says your time is up, outlaw," he sneered, spitting a wad of tobacco near Silas's feet. "Heard you've been trespassing down by the creek. That's Thorne's land. He wants you gone. From the farm, from the town. Or he'll finish what he started in the street." Silas didn't move. He stood with the axe in his hand, its weight held loosely, not as a threat, but as an extension of his arm. He didn't look at Cole. His eyes were on the other 2 men, who were still on their horses, their hands resting near their hips. "The boy was sick," Silas said, his voice flat and even. "I was gathering herbs." Cole laughed. "Excuses. Thorne's got the deed. He says you were poaching. That's enough for the marshal to get involved." From the cabin porch, Elara watched, her heart pounding. This was it, the escalation she had feared. Thorne was no longer content to isolate them. He was manufacturing a reason to remove Silas by force. She saw one of the men dismount and walk toward her small chicken coop. He kicked the flimsy door open, sending the hens scattering with frightened squawks. "Nice setup you got here," the man said with a leering grin. "Be a shame if something happened to it." That was when Silas moved. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply took 3 deliberate steps forward, placing himself between the men and the house. He raised his head, and for the first time, looked directly at Cole. There was no anger in his eyes. There was something far more unnerving, a complete and utter absence of fear. He was a mountain. He was an unmovable object. He didn't need to raise the axe. His presence, his stillness, was more powerful than any weapon. "Leave," he said. The word was not a request. It was a command, spoken with an authority that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. Cole hesitated. He had come expecting a confrontation, a fight with a cornered animal. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable resolve. He looked at Silas's eyes, at the solid set of his jaw, and he saw a man who would not be broken, a man who had nothing left to lose, and would therefore lose nothing. The bravado drained from Cole's face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced at his men, who were now looking less confident. The quiet strength of one man had completely shifted the balance of power. Cole spat on the ground again, a final, futile gesture of defiance. "This ain't over," he grumbled, before climbing back onto his horse. The 3 men rode away, their retreat far less intimidating than their arrival. Silas stood motionless until they were out of sight. He then turned, his gaze finding Elara on the porch. The tension of the moment still hung in the air, but beneath it was a new certainty. He had not fought them with violence, but with integrity. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for her, for Finn, for the fragile sanctuary they had built. And in that moment, Elara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this man would die before he let any more harm come to their home. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over the farm. It was not the tense, watchful silence of strangers, but a comfortable, breathing silence of people who understood each other without the need for words. The threat from Thorne still loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but within the newly mended fences of the farm, there was a sense of peace. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the changing seasons and the needs of the land. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, his steady labor a constant, reassuring presence. He repaired the barn, cleared a new field, and reinforced the cabin for the coming winter. Elara worked alongside him, their tasks often intertwining in a seamless, unspoken partnership. She would bring him water. He would have already sharpened her tools. They were two halves of a whole, working to rebuild a life from the remnants of their broken pasts. One evening, they sat by the fire, the cabin filled with the smell of baking bread. Finn was asleep in the loft, the wooden bird clutched in his hand. The silence was soft, companionable. Elara was mending one of Finn's shirts, her fingers moving with practiced ease. She noticed Silas watching her hands. His gaze was fixed on a pale, jagged scar that ran across her knuckles. It was a scar she had carried for years, a physical reminder of a past she tried to forget. She paused in her sewing, her hands still. She expected him to look away, to respect the boundary of her pain. Instead, he simply waited, his expression open and patient. She looked down at the scar, and for the first time felt the urge to give it a voice. "It was from my husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was not a brave man. When the bandits came, he tried to bargain with them. He offered them me. She stopped, the memory a knot of ice in her stomach. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't offer pity. He just listened, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor. She took a breath and continued, the words coming more easily now that they were spoken into the safe space he provided. "I fought. This was from a broken bottle. I got away. He did not." The story hung in the air between them, stark and painful. It was the truth behind the town's whispers, the source of her shame and her isolation. She had been judged not for being a victim, but for surviving when her husband had not. She finally dared to look at him, expecting to see judgment, or perhaps disgust. Instead, she saw an empathy so profound it stole her breath. He reached out, not to touch her, but simply extending his hand, palm up, in a gesture of offering. It was an invitation to share the weight of her burden. Hesitantly, she placed her scarred hand in his. His fingers were calloused and warm, his grip gentle but firm. He didn't stroke her hand or try to soothe her. He just held it, acknowledging her pain, honoring her strength. He looked at her, his stone gray eyes holding hers. "You fought," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "You survived. That is not shame. That is courage." In his words, in his touch, she felt years of shame and loneliness begin to dissolve. He was not just seeing her scar. He was seeing her. And in that quiet moment of acceptance, she felt a profound and undeniable shift. The fragile stirring of her heart had blossomed into something deeper, something stronger, something that felt terrifyingly and wonderfully like love. A stranger rode into town a few weeks later. He wasn't a drifter. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man of the law, though his badge was pinned to the inside of his coat, not the outside. He was an older man, with eyes that had seen too much and a face lined with the memory of hard trails. He made quiet inquiries at the saloon, asking about a man named Silas, a man with gray eyes and a past he didn't talk about. Thorne, ever watchful, approached the lawman, a congenial smile fixed on his face, eager to paint his own narrative. "The man you're looking for is an outlaw, Marshal," Thorne said, offering to buy the man a drink. "A dangerous man. The town has him under a kind of probation, confined to the old Miller place with the widow." The marshal, whose name was Kane, accepted the drink but not the story. He listened patiently, his gaze shrewd, as Thorne spun a tale of Silas's supposed violence and criminality. "Is that so?" Kane said when Thorne had finished, his voice deceptively mild. "Funny, the Silas I knew wasn't a man given to unprovoked violence." Thorne's smile tightened. "Men change." "Some do," Kane agreed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "But a man's fundamental nature, that's a harder thing to alter. Tell me, Mr. Thorne, what is your interest in this man's land? Or rather, the land he's staying on?" Thorne stiffened. "I have an interest in this town's safety." Kane gave a slow nod. "Of course. But I've been a lawman for 30 years. I've learned one thing. When a man is as eager to see another man hang as you are, the reason is usually greed, not justice." He finished his drink and placed the glass on the bar with a decisive click. "The Silas I knew was a Texas Ranger, one of the best. He lost his wife and daughter in a fire set by the McBain gang. He hunted them down. Every last one. He didn't do it for the law. He did it for vengeance. When he was done, he just walked away. Left the badge, the life, everything. Some said he was broken. Some said he was just empty. But no one ever called him an outlaw." The marshal left the saloon, leaving Thorne standing at the bar, his face pale. The story was not the one he had been selling. It was more complicated, more tragic. This wasn't some common drifter. This was a man with a history, a man who knew how to fight, a man who had once been the very law Thorne was now trying to manipulate. From a shadowed corner, one of the town councilmen who had overheard the exchange hurried out after Thorne. "Jedediah, if what that marshal says is true." Thorne turned on him, his eyes blazing with a new kind of manic energy. "It doesn't matter what he was. It only matters what this town believes he is now, and I will make sure they believe he is a threat." His plan was unraveling. The quiet, broken man he'd intended to crush was something else entirely. The fear that had driven Silas from the world was gone, replaced by a reason to stand and fight. Thorne knew he was running out of time. He had to act now, decisively and cruelly, before the marshal's truth could take root in the town's consciousness. He had to create a crime so undeniable, so public, that no story of a heroic past could ever erase it. His gaze drifted toward the mercantile, a new vicious plan forming in his mind. He would not just get rid of Silas. He would burn down everything the man had started to build. The fire started late at night, a hungry orange glow that lit up the sky. It wasn't Elara's farm. It was the town mercantile. Flames devoured the dry wood of the building, a pillar of smoke and embers rising into the cold, clear air. The townspeople stumbled from their homes, their faces a mixture of shock and fear, as they formed a desperate, futile bucket brigade. Jedediah Thorne was at the forefront, his face a mask of civic concern, shouting orders, directing the chaos. And then he made his move. "Where is he?" Thorne roared, his voice cutting through the crackle of the flames. "Where is the outlaw? Who else would do this? He's trying to destroy us, starve us out for the winter." Fear, once again, became his most potent weapon. He planted the seed of suspicion, and in the panicked minds of the townspeople, it took instant root. It made a dark, terrible sense. The silent outcast, the man they had already judged, was the obvious culprit. By the time the mercantile had burned to a smoldering ruin, Thorne had his mob, They were no longer just concerned citizens. They were a vengeful posse, their faces lit by the dying embers of the fire, their hands holding pitchforks, rifles, and the coiled rope that had been denied its purpose once before. They marched through the night, a river of angry torchlight flowing toward the small, isolated farm on the edge of town. A lone rider broke from the group, galloping ahead. It was the Marshal Kane. He had seen this kind of fire before. A fire meant not just to burn a building, but to burn a man. He arrived at the farm minutes before the mob, his horse panting, its breath pluming in the cold air. "Silas!" he yelled, dismounting before the horse had even stopped. The cabin door opened. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the warm light from the hearth. Elara was behind him, her face pale with dread. "They've burned the mercantile," Kane said, his voice grim, "and Thorne is blaming you. He's coming with half the town. You need to leave, now." Silas looked past the marshal, toward the growing orange glow on the horizon, the angry shouts of the mob just now becoming audible on the wind. He looked back into the cabin, at Elara, at the sleeping loft where Finn lay. He had run once before. He had run from the memory of his family, from the ashes of his life. He had spent years running, hiding in the empty spaces of the world, but he wasn't running anymore. This small cabin, this broken patch of land, this resilient woman, and this silent boy, they had become his home. They were his reason to stop running and start fighting. "No," Silas said, his voice quiet but absolute. He stepped out onto the porch, his bare feet planting firmly on the cold wood. Elara came to stand beside him, her hand finding his in the dark. She did not try to convince him to run. She simply stood with him, her presence a silent declaration of faith. Kane looked at them, at the determined set of their jaws, at their joined hands. He saw not two victims waiting for the inevitable, but two soldiers standing ready on the ramparts of their fortress. He sighed, a weary sound. He was an old man, tired of fighting other people's battles. But he was also a man who recognized honor when he saw it. He slowly drew his pistol, not with aggression, but with a sense of grim resignation. "All right, Ranger," he said softly. "Let's make our stand." The mob arrived like a wave of fire and anger, their torches casting flickering, monstrous shadows against the cabin. Thorne was at their head, his face twisted with a righteous fury. It was wholly manufactured. "Silas, come out and face your judgment. You've terrorized this town for the last time." The cabin door remained closed. The house was dark and silent, seeming to hold its breath. The silence unnerved the crowd. They had expected a cornered rat, not this stoic defiance. Thorne grew impatient. "He's in there, hiding behind the woman. Burn him out." A few men surged forward, their torches held high, ready to set the very home they had come to condemn alight. Suddenly, a voice cut through the clamor, calm and clear. "That's far enough." It was Marshal Kane. He stepped out from the shadows of the barn, his pistol held loosely at his side. The crowd faltered, surprised by his presence. "Go home," Kane said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed. "This is official business now, not a lynching." Thorne scoffed. "This is town business, Marshal. He burned down our store." "Did he?" Kane replied, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "I was in the saloon when the fire started. So was half the town. But you know who wasn't, Mr. Thorne. Your man, Cole. Saw him slip out the back not 10 minutes before the bell rang." A murmur went through the crowd. Cole, who was standing near Thorne, paled. "That's a lie," Thorne bellowed. "He's trying to protect his outlaw friend." Just then, the cabin door opened. But it wasn't Silas who stepped out. It was Elara. She stood on the porch, a lantern in her hand, its gentle light illuminating her face. She looked not at Thorne, but at the townspeople, her neighbors. "You know me," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "You have judged me. You have shunned me. But you have also seen me. Have you ever known me to be a liar?" She paused, letting her words sink in. "The man you call an outlaw spent 2 days and nights fighting to save the life of a sick child. He has mended my fences, protected my home, and asked for nothing in return. He is a good and honorable man." Her eyes found Mrs. Gable from the mercantile. "He is not the monster. The monster is the man who would let a child die to settle a score. The monster is the man who would burn down his own town and blame an innocent man just to get his hands on a piece of land." Thorne's face was a mask of fury. "She's lying." "She's bewitched by him." But his words were losing their power. Doubt was a seed, and Elara's quiet, heartfelt testimony had planted it in the minds of the mob. They looked from her earnest face to Thorne's sputtering rage, and they began to see the truth. The front door opened again, and this time Silas stepped out to stand beside Elara. He wasn't armed. He didn't look defiant. He simply stood there, a quiet, solid presence. He was no longer hiding. He was home. His gaze met Thorne's, and in that silent, final confrontation, Thorne saw his plan, his power, and his future crumble to ash. It was over. The anger of the mob was turning to shame, their torches now lighting their own complicity in Thorne's greed. The wave of hatred had broken against the unyielding rock of two people standing together for what was right. In the quiet aftermath, the mob dissolved. They didn't leave in anger, but in a slow, shamed procession, their torches lowered, their faces turned away from the small cabin they had come to destroy. Marshal Kane dealt with Thorne and his men, the truth of the arson coming out in a torrent of panicked confessions. Justice, it turned out, was not a rope in the town square, but a quiet reckoning in the light of day. By dawn, the farm was quiet again. The only evidence of the night's events was the trampled earth where the crowd had stood. Elara, Silas, and Kane sat at the small kitchen table, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove, its aroma filling the room with a sense of normalcy. Finn came down from the loft, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He saw Silas and ran to him, wrapping his small arms around the man's legs, a silent affirmation that his protector was safe. Silas rested a hand on the boy's head, a gesture full of a gentle paternal love. Kane watched them, a small, sad smile on his face. "The Rangers would take you back, you know," he said quietly to Silas. "A man like you, there's always a place for you." Silas looked around the small, worn cabin. He looked at the woman who had stood for him, at the boy who had trusted him. He had spent years running from the ghost of a home he had lost. He had not expected to find another one. "I think my place is here, Marshal," he said, his voice steady. Kane nodded. He understood. He finished his coffee, stood, and placed his hat on his head. "You let me know if you have any more trouble." He paused at the door and looked back at Elara. "You chose a good man to stand for, Mom." And then he was gone, a lone rider disappearing over the horizon. Elara and Silas were left alone in the quiet of the morning. The air was thick with all the things that had been left unsaid, all the emotions that had been forged in the crucible of the past weeks. She walked out onto the porch, breathing in the cold, clean air. A gentle snow had begun to fall, its soft, white flakes covering the trampled ground, blanketing the world in a pristine layer of peace and new beginnings. Silas followed her, standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching. They watched the snow fall in comfortable silence. The future was unwritten, a blank page. The town might never fully accept them. Hardships would surely come. But for the first time, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was not one of passion, but of deep, abiding certainty. It was the touch of a man who had found his anchor. She curled her fingers around his, her scarred hand fitting perfectly in his strong one. There were no grand declarations, no whispered words of love. There didn't need to be. Everything that mattered was in that simple, profound connection. They had faced down the storm together, and now, in the quiet peace of the first snow, they were ready to face the dawn. What does it truly mean to see a person's soul? Is it a single act of courage, or the quiet, steady rhythm of a life lived with honor? As you look at the world around you, perhaps you'll ask yourself that same question. Thank you for listening, and if you found a piece of your own heart in this story, please consider subscribing for more tales of the human spirit.